Thank you, Carl, and thanks everyone for coming. Hopefully you're here for more than just the air conditioning. Although it does feel pretty nice. My wife and I were out visiting our daughter and husband in Colorado, and because they're well up in the mountains, they normally don't get this kind of heat. So they just have ceiling fans throughout the house, no air conditioning. Well, they had record-breaking heat wave, and so we were sitting around in the house because it was too hot to go out, trying to get what little we could get from box fans and ceiling fans, and still sweating bullets. Good to see you all, and thanks, Carl. I'd like to build on what Carl said, and this man, Solomon Northup, had an interesting story, but it's one in which there's much more beyond just the movie. And so I want to add to that a little bit and also talk about what his America was like at the time, because much of what went into slavery and some of the even more nefarious things surrounding slavery don't often get told. How many of you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave 4 years ago? Okay, a few of you did. How many of the rest of you have heard, prior to Carl putting this program together, heard the name Solomon Northup? Carl's got his hand up, another person. In his time, for a brief moment, he was second only to Frederick Douglass as a best-selling author among Black Americans, because his story was just one that caught the public sentiment, public attention. Well, I'd like to go a little bit of his background, tease some things out along the way, tease some understandings that I think I have learned of what allowed him to, imagine being free and have your freedom taken away through no fault of your own. You didn't do anything. And then being able to reclaim it and tell people about your experience. Well, this is the Solomon Northup that most Americans probably know from the film 12 Years a Slave, which did win the Academy Award for Best Picture. An African actor, Chiwetel Ejiofor, played Solomon Northup. This is the 19th century image we have of Solomon Northup from the frontispiece of his autobiography or slave narrative. And there are no known photographs other than something I discovered today of him. It's either a photograph, probably a lithograph of him as a young boy. So we don't have that much to work from other than the artist's rendering for the autobiography. Well, he was born free in the North, but his father, a man named Mintus Northup, actually had been born a slave. One of the things we forget is that slavery, prior to the American Revolution, was not a northern phenomenon or a southern phenomenon. It was an American phenomenon. Vermont had slavery. New Hampshire had slavery. Massachusetts was the first colony to make it legal. Those Puritans. It wasn't Virginia. It wasn't Georgia. It wasn't South Carolina. It was those Puritans. And from Georgia up to the northernmost parts of New England, you had slavery. Now, it was concentrated in certain places where it was more economically productive. The Chesapeake region, Virginia, Maryland, tobacco growing, and during the colonial era, Carolinas and Georgia, rice growing. His father had been born a slave in New England to a family called the Northups, a white family. And he had been taken as this Northup family moved westward to the Hudson River Valley in eastern New York. And there, up the Hudson River Valley, his father, Mintus, worked as a slave, and he was ultimately freed in 1798. You had two things happening a lot of Northerners, because they were less economically dependent on slavery, were moved by the rhetoric of revolution, liberty, equality, natural rights. And so they sometimes individually freed or manumitted their slaves after the revolution. In other cases, northern states were moving to act against slavery. So either immediately through court cases or more likely gradually through laws that gradually phased out slavery, gradually emancipated northern slaves. Slaves were being freed. And then you get to this phenomenon of the North being the free states and the South being the slave states, and that's where it begins, after the Revolution. His grave, Mintus Northup's grave, has been discovered in pieces there in Hudson River Valley, and plans are afoot to actually restore it to close to its original condition. Solomon's born almost a decade after his father was freed in 1807. He grew up in the Hudson River Valley. He had some education in local common schools. He married Ann Hampton when he was 21, a local seamstress, and they had 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. He did what husbands have done for a long time to support their family when they were working class, and then they did whatever they had to do. Sometimes it meant taking on a lot of jobs, sometimes seasonal jobs as things changed throughout the year. He did work on canals. He rafted goods including lumber, down the Hudson River. He worked in lumbering. He worked as a wage laborer on area farms. And he supplemented his income too by virtue of the fact that he was a skilled fiddler. He played for local dances and was quite sought after, and usually on a weekend he could make some good extra money that came in handy with the family budget. Anne contributed too. Anne became renowned for her cooking, began working in the kitchens of area hotels, and also as needed as a domestic servant, usually for terms of weeks or months in local wealthy people's houses. Here's a reconstruction for purposes of the film 12 Years a Slave of what might have been a typical scene for the Northup family, living a fairly happy working class existence outside the United States Hotel, walking in their finery down the street, demonstrating that they were respectable Americans. Well, in 1834, Solomon and Ann make the decision to move to Saratoga Springs. This was going to be their chance to, if not strike it rich, at least get a more comfortable existence. They were looking for better opportunities for their children, and Saratoga Springs presented that opportunity. It was a resort town. In the 19th century, it was one of a handful of places one went to enjoy spas. There were a lot of fine restaurants and hotels. There was a lot always going on entertainment-wise, and it was known as a prominent watering place. A lot of prominent American politicians, writers like Washington Irving, a whole host of other people loved going to Saratoga Springs. There were a lot of advantages to being in Saratoga Springs for a free black person like Solomon and his wife Ann. There were better economic opportunities. Working in hotels in Saratoga Springs paid better, for example, than in any other cities up and down the Hudson River Valley. There was much more going on entertainment-wise, so Solomon would be recruited and paid to play his fiddle Second thing was, for free blacks living outside of Saratoga Springs, rural America, there were better cultural opportunities. There was a black community of 65 families there in 1834, plus black institutions like black churches, black literary societies, benevolent organizations, and a whole host of other things. Well, Solomon worked hard as a hack driver. What's a hack driver? Taxi, yeah, basically a taxi carriage. He worked locally as a carpenter. He continued to raft goods down the Hudson River Valley, and he worked a lot more as a fiddler, and gained a reputation as a leading hotel cook. And Hampton's pies and other delicacies were renowned locally. This is something I just discovered today when I was looking for other images on Solomon Northup and his fiddling, and I found that someone has discovered an image of young Solomon Northup with a violin. And I look at that and I think, for someone who was born free, who I think is probably about 14 or so at this time, you see the pride, you see the kind of the zest for life. There's a man who's going to do something, who's going to make it. Well, let me talk a little bit about free black life in New York at the time, 1834, when they would have moved to Saratoga Springs. It was a lot better than being a slave, but it was far from perfect. Being free black did not mean equal. New York was not amongst the worst states for treatments of free blacks. Many of those were in the South or in the West, places like Indiana and Illinois were really unkind to free blacks. There's a lot you could do because you had mobility, you weren't owned. You could hire your services out to people at your own will, but there were limitations. In many states, even of the North or locales, there were certain jobs that you were prohibited from doing by law, by virtue of being a free black. Outside of New England, states didn't allow free blacks, men then, to vote. Most states, they weren't allowed to serve on juries. Many states, they were not allowed to testify in court cases against whites. I've read just terrible descriptions of blacks who opened stores or other businesses, and white men would walk in and walk out with goods, but the black owner could not take them to court unless he could find a white man that was there that was willing to testify that the other white man stole the goods. So a lot of things working against them. In the case of New York, you could vote as a free black man if you owned a lot of property. That's only a tiny percentage were actually allowed to vote because they had large enough property ownership. Now, all white men could vote unless they were incarcerated. But free black men, it's only a few who are really, really rich. So free black life wasn't a panacea, but things were looking up for Solomon. And by the time you get to 1841, when he is kidnapped into slavery, they'd been in Saratoga Springs 7 years. They'd gotten a house. Solomon and Ann had gotten a reputation, Solomon for his fiddling, Ann for her baked goods in the hotels. Their kids were growing nicely. Everybody seemed happy. They were enjoying the camaraderie of the local black community. And then something happened that would turn their world upside down. And that was Solomon met two men Um, Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton played in the movie by the two men you see here. Solomon was playing on a weekend at a dance, playing his fiddle, and at the end of the dance, these two men came up and said, "We're entertainment procurers, and we really like what we heard, and we'd be willing to pay you big money. Right now, there's a desperate need for musicians with the Circus." Well, where's the Circus? Washington, D.C. Solomon's first instinct had to be, that's outside of the Free States. That's enslaved territory. And his first response was to say no. He knew he could use the money that they were offering, but there was a lot of danger. The two men continued to hang around Saratoga Springs, increase the offer, assure him that he would be safe. They would get, his free papers confirmed in New York City before they headed southward. And finally, after a period of days, they wore Solomon down, and he agreed to go south for a period of weeks and play with this circus. In the carriage on the way southward, one of the men with Solomon there said, "Let's have a celebratory drink." And the next thing Solomon knew, he was in a slave pen, a slave jail in Washington, D.C., and he had lost his freedom and his freedom papers. What happened to Solomon was not all that unusual. In a high-profit industry like slave trading, buying and selling of slaves, people will do all sorts of nefarious stuff. Just think about all the nefarious stuff people do for money today, right? Drug business and everything else. What was known as kidnapping on the border between slavery and freedom involved taking free men like Solomon Northup and converting them into slaves. Now, it didn't always happen to be adult men like Solomon. Solomon had a lot of skills that made him extremely valuable, that made him a target. But it happened to lots of other people. Among the people most threatened were free black children, because they could easily be tricked. If you go here with me, I've got some candy, I've got a surprise, come see this puppy that whatever. And, or they could be knocked out with something put in a bag or a box and moved easily. Particularly this happened on the borderland between the slave states and the free states, places like southern Pennsylvania, along the Ohio River, other places. But it happened throughout the North. Free black parents, I've read, were so frightened by the prospect of kidnapping of young children that they were very hesitant to let their children go out and play because of what might happen to them. For those of us of our generation that grew up, you just went out and played, right? Till the street lights came on and beyond, and you didn't worry about it, and your parents didn't worry all that much about you, right? You played. Well, kidnapping prevented that. So all sorts of people, from a virile adult man like Solomon Northup to children, were threatened by this. Well, Solomon is kidnapped. He wakes up in this slave jail. They actually arrived in D.C. at a very auspicious time. There was a lot of other activity going on that meant that people didn't look at these two men escorting this knocked out black man. It was the inauguration of a new president who had just died in 1 month, William Henry Harrison. And every thought in D.C. was tied up with the funeral. Well, Solomon spent some time in D.C. but he spent it here, not in the crowd overlooking the funeral cortege or in any other place, but he was in this pen. This building was what was known as a slave pen or slave jail. It was owned by two men, Mr. Price and a man named Jim Birch, who were in the slave trading business, but they weren't above for money slipped behind under the table or whatever, weren't above taking on board and faking papers for someone who'd been kidnapped that now would say they were a slave. And this is what happened, and Solomon is in this place. He's beaten severely for days. This is from an artist rendering from his book. He's beaten severely for days. Part of the purpose is Solomon was one of those guys that kept saying, once he got his wits about it, but I'm a free man, but I'm a free man, but I'm a free man. The last thing a slave trader wants is somebody walking around saying, I'm a free man. So the first thing is to create a sense of submission in Solomon. They never entirely succeeded, but at least he learned to keep his mouth shut in the short run. They forged up slave ownership papers, and they gave him a new name, Platt. Slaves usually didn't have surnames, so Solomon Northup becomes Platt. Now think for a moment of Anne and their 3 children and their friends, including white friends, one well-connected up in Saratoga Springs, saying, Solomon's gone. How do we find Solomon? This is the 19th century. There's no social media. There's no Social Security records. There's no credit card records. To say that there was any sophistication in the tracking done by law enforcement was a misnomer, because all you had, because for the most part this is pre-photography, you would have posters that might be posted that would give some minimal description about a person, and that would be it. So how do you track somebody who now is in this pipeline down to the slavery in the Deep South, who had this name Solomon Northup and now is called Platt, and there's no way of verifying, documenting, tracing, tracking, whatever? Well, ultimately, once he's thought to be properly submissive, he becomes part of a group that's marched at midnight to a waiting boat on the Potomac River for shipment as a slave to New Orleans, Louisiana. He was going to become part of the domestic slave trade. For those of us who at least know something about the Atlantic slave trade, the so-called Middle Passage, we know that there were millions of slaves, ultimately 10 million probably landed in the Americas, brought from the west coast, largely of Africa, and we focus on that horrific, usually multi-month voyage, and the deaths that occurred, the family division, the disorientation, and everything else that went on with it. But we forget there's another slave trade that takes place in America during the 19th century that is even larger in terms of the US context. There are probably about 400,000 of those 10 million slaves in the Atlantic slave trade that are brought into what becomes the US. Because of the slave family, they grow ultimately by the time of the Civil War to about 4 million. But there's at least 1 million slaves after the beginning of the 19th century and before the Civil War, at least 1 million slaves that are taken like Solomon from the upper South, like the Chesapeake, down to the lower South. What's going on in the lower South that makes them want slaves so bad? Cotton. The cotton kingdom is growing by leaps and bounds. The 19th century version of the American dream, if a young man, American or immigrant, can get enough money to buy a little land, buy a couple slaves, have a good crop year. The next year he can invest in more land, more slaves, and have that dream of eventually being part of the wealthy elite themselves. And with wealth came social, political, and other kinds of power. Here's what the movie shows in terms of Solomon being boarded for the, actually being landed in New Orleans, and Theophilus Freeman, the trader there in New Orleans, beginning to look over the cargo that's arrived. What's going to happen to them? There were 41 slaves on board. They were probably going to end up at 10, 15, 20, 30 different locations. This was the beginning of feeding them out to whoever would pay the most for them once they got to New Orleans. And so at this end of the line, there were actively a number of agents and businesses involved in New Orleans or in other southern cities like Natchez or Mobile that were receiving these slaves through the domestic slave trade. And then they'd end up in the Mississippi Delta, they'd end up in Louisiana, they'd end up in Arkansas and other places as slaves. Solomon was sold for $900. That's 1841. That's not a bad price. He's a good physical specimen, as they would say then. He's 34. He's a little older than they'd like. Ideally, they'd like to buy young men 15 to 25 who had a lot of prime work years ahead of them. He's got other skills, carpentry. That makes him a little more valuable. Fiddling, that makes him more valuable. And as they would learn, the skill of successfully rafting goods, including lumber, downriver, made him more valuable. He's initially sold in New Orleans to a man named William Prince Ford, lives in central Louisiana, Red River Valley, Cottonland. William Prince Ford is what was called in the context of that day a kind master. Now, Frederick Douglass, the noted black abolitionist, had something to say about that. He said, the kindest person who would hold another person in slavery is not a kind master. He'd later be hired out to a pretty brutal poor white named John Tibbets, who used him with lumbering and so forth. And Tibbets was very much challenged by the fact that Solomon spoke without a southern accent, acted and spoke as if he had ability. He commanded the respect of the other slaves. This drove Tibbets wild. And Tibbets was brutal towards Solomon Northup. And then he was sold to and spent his last 10 years with a man named Edwin Epps. I'll talk a little bit more about him, but Epps was what we might call nouveau riche. He's a man who had been poor but had made it by buying land, buying a few slaves, making it with a good year, buying more land, buying more slaves, and so forth. So Solomon got a mix of experiences, most of them brutal. I mean, the treatment he got from Ford was much kinder for those first 2 years. The last years, much, much more brutal. Let me offer some theories I have for why he survived slavery, and survived it relatively well. One, he was in good physical condition when he started. Slavery and the slave trade has a way of breaking people down physically, emotionally, psychologically. He started in good physical condition. He was intelligent, and he could use that to his advantage. He had important skills, and masters understood that he was of value to them more than just the ordinary slave. He kept well informed. He listened to everything that went on the plantation, at the general store, on the road, and tried to use it to his advantage. People liked him in the slave community, and even other whites, and he'd sometimes received help from others. This allowed him to survive, but the thought of escaping back to Saratoga Springs from central Louisiana was virtually impossible. We live in a part of the world where we're used to thinking about the Underground Railroad and runaway slaves making up to Canada and so forth. Somebody went through the Canadian census and found, I think it's 80% of all the slaves that made it to Canada, for example, came from Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, Virginia, Maryland, right up against the free states. Okay. If you escaped from central Louisiana, you'd have to face a lot of swamps, what they called Negro dogs. Those were the tracking dogs. In fact, one of our presidents, Zachary Taylor, who was a slaveholder and a military man, made his reputation outside of the military by raising bloodhounds for tracking slaves, and then would sell them to other slaveholders or train them for other slaveholders. And so Negro dogs, as they were called, patrols, these were the groups that would ride, of white men that would ride, patrolling local beats. That's where the term beats that police used came from, the slave patrols. And ultimately, if they thought their slave made it out of the area, they would spend massive amount on rewards and on ads, handbills and newspaper ads to reclaim them, usually with success. A lot more people got caught before they got very far than made it out of slavery. Well, the last 10 years or so he's spending with Epps. Here's a scene from the movie. Epps was known for his brutality. He was, shall we say, a womanizer, a drinker. He was characterized by fellow slaveholders in his neighborhood as one who used the lash liberally. That's a term for he whipped his slaves a lot. The story, if you remember it from the movie, of him having this relationship, coerced sexual relationship with Patsy, the young female slave, was a historical truth. And as happened in the movie, he sometimes, in a drunken stupor, would wake all the slaves up at night and say, you know, Solomon fiddle, other slaves dance, and so forth. Now keep in mind, this is a population whose job requires them to work from sunup to sundown. The thought of getting woken up in the middle of the night to party is not high on their agenda. Solomon spent most of his days at Epps working in the sugar and cotton fields and behind the scenes trying to get information north. He was notoriously unsuccessful. He'd started doing this on the slave ship southward, trying to find whites he thought he could trust. Since he's literate, slipping them a note addressed to Ann Hampton or to his white patron in Saratoga Springs, Henry Northup, who's descended from this family that had owned his father. Working hard. Solomon showed a skill for leadership, for crafts, carpentry, other things, and certainly had the respect of his fellow slaves. Well, let's back off to the big picture for a moment. Why do I call it Solomon Northup's America? Because lots happening beyond just where he is that's changing the scenario. In ways we can't imagine today, even with things like our current confusion and division and partisanship over issues like immigration. We can't imagine what it was like in the mid-19th century in America when slavery entered the political conversation at the national level. Look at those beige states. Those are the free states and territories. The green, the slave states and territories. British North America and Mexico don't allow slavery by this time, so you guess where people want to run if they can. In fact, if you're in Louisiana and Texas, better to run in Mexico. And there were large runaway slave communities that developed there. But the red and the blue, that's what the other two groups are fighting over. Because as these areas are settled, become territories, and then possibly states, both sides are trying to work very hard to make sure that they maintain some degree of competitiveness in national politics. You don't want more slave states if you're a slave state, if you're a free state, because that'll change the balance of senators particularly, and vice versa. And as bad as we might think it is today when we turn on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or read the newspaper or read things online, 1850s, when Solomon's still in slavery, the nation does a couple things that rips the party system apart and literally brings violence to the halls of Congress. The Compromise of 1850 did 5 major things. It was intended as a compromise that would settle the slavery issue in national politics forever. I'm always suspicious of politicians who say, you don't have to worry anymore. The bill itself, 5 separate agreements, 5 separate compromises. One of the things it did was to toughen up the fugitive slave law, to put the federal business in the business of recapturing fugitive slaves, even in places like Detroit. They might have run away from Kentucky, but now federal marshals, federal judges are in the business of helping to return them. And if you walk out in the street, they can deputize you into part of their posse. And if you resist, or if you're caught helping a runaway slave escape, you're liable to 6 months of jail time and or a $1,000 fine. Put it in context, an average working man in 1850, $600 a year was a pretty good wage. Think what a $1,000 fine would be to pay, right? The second part is the nation in 1820 had settled something called the Missouri Compromise, so that everything north, all that red territory that you see, was an area that was close to slavery as part of the compromise. It was settled law. You hear that term now when we're talking about bringing another Supreme Court judge on board, right? I've heard that term over the last week more than stare decisis, settled law. We've agreed to it for like a generation or two. It's a done deal. And then pressure from Southern congressmen forced through something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which reopened that territory to slavery. And so the nation, late in the time Solomon's a slave, couldn't be at any more of a tinderbox than it was. And in fact, senators and congressmen were going into the halls of Congress carrying derringers and bowie knives for the self-protection. It was that divided, it was that dangerous. In fact, there's one incident that will happen shortly after Solomon's freed, in which a abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, a guy named Charles Sumner, had made a speech on the floor of Congress which had, shall we say, challenged the manhood of a South Carolina senator over his stand about slavery. And his nephew, who was a congressman from the same state, caught him at his desk, took his wooden walking stick, and beat him until he was an invalid. He literally Sumner had to rest his desk, which was bolted to the floor. He had to rest it out of there to get loose, and he was unable to fulfill his congressional duties for about 2 years as he's recovering. This was how divided America was over slavery. So Solomon is, at the local level, fighting slavery. At the same time, the nation is very much fighting over slavery. Well, the years go on, and Solomon continues to try to get word out. Anne and Henry Northup, his white patron in Saratoga Springs, continue to try to track him. There's dead end after dead end. Finally, a Canadian carpenter, a guy named Samuel Bass, who was a skilled carpenter who liked to travel. He was unattached, and he also, even though Canadian, probably didn't like those Canadian winters. And so he would work in places like Louisiana, hire himself out to the people who could pay the most money, which was usually slaveholders. And so he's building outbuildings and, new and larger homes and so forth for them. Because of his carpenter skills, Solomon is, ordered by his master to help Bass do this carpentry work. And they become friends. Finally, after a good bit of time, he thinks he could trust Bass. He was very cautious because he thought he could trust some of these other people that he'd asked to get letters out. But finally, he trusts Bass, and he writes 3 letters to people in the North that he has Bass send, and Bass doesn't send them locally. He takes them several towns away to mail them, hoping to get away with this. One makes its way to Henry Northup. I'm going to talk about in a moment. One is headed to a local storekeeper in Saratoga Springs, and one is headed actually to the media. Only one of them apparently makes its mark, and that is the one to Henry Northup. This is Henry Northup. Henry Northup was politically important. He was a descendant of the white family that had owned Mingus Northup, Solomon's father, and other Northups before. And they had continued to have a kind of a patron-client relationship. If you were free black in New York or elsewhere, anywhere in the North or South, it was advantageous to have a well-connected white person to look out for your interests. Well, when the letter gets to Henry Northup's kind of busy. The letter basically says, can you work right away to get me sprung from this mess I'm in? Here's where I'm at. Names the plantation, names the owner. Henry's running for Congress. I can't take time away from the campaign. He loses in early November, and then he starts turning his full attention towards Solomon. He collects affidavits throughout Saratoga Springs and other places Solomon has lived, verifying, from white people, verifying that Solomon Northup was born free, has lived there his whole life in the North till he was captured into slavery, is a respectable person, et cetera, et cetera. Then he heads off to D.C., where he knows a lot of people. I said he was well connected. He gets letters from important political figures. He knew, for example, members of the Supreme Court. They wrote letters. He knew one of the senators from Louisiana. He wrote a letter. And you might say, why would the senator from Louisiana write a letter that ultimately is going to work against the interests of his own citizens in Louisiana? Slavery had laws, and in order to convince themselves, I think, that they were doing the right thing, many of the politicians were very law conscious. So if there was a law allowing free blacks, they were going to enforce that. He knew the Secretary of War, what we call the Defense Secretary today. He got a letter from him. Then he heads off to Louisiana. Well, the letter had been posted in Marksville, Louisiana, but some of the details were a little bit fuzzy. So Henry Northup had to do a lot of detective work to find Bass, then to track to the Epps plantation, get a warrant from the local sheriff for Solomon's release. Here's the Autobiography's woodcut of what Solomon's release may have looked like when Henry North shows up with the sheriff with warrant in hand on January 3rd, 1853, after nearly 12 years in slavery. And here's the slave narratives or autobiographies representation of what it must have looked like when, shortly after Solomon arrives home in Saratoga Springs and is greeted by his wife and children, now all grown up. He's missed their growing up years, but joyous at being reunited. Solomon is recruited, and it doesn't take much persuasion, is recruited by some people in the abolitionist movement to begin telling his story, and he does. The case is such an unusual one, and he's such a good vehicle for telling the story, that it starts getting coverage throughout the media, the magazine and newspaper press in the North. Creates a sensation, it's widely discussed. And interesting, the timing is good because this is early 1853, just as another media sensation, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, is becoming a sensation, a bestseller. He quickly produces his own autobiography, 12 Years a Slave, with the help of a local writer, David Wilson, who, by a look at the rest of his publications, wasn't necessarily anti-slavery. He was a good storyteller as well. And they put together a very interesting slave autobiography. It was published in July 1853. He's only been out of slavery half a year, 6 months. It sold incredibly well. Why did it sell so well? Timing, like I said, is part of it. Uncle Tom's Cabin, slave narratives are selling well, whole range of other, there's this national media sensation around his case. It's also very well written. If you want to read a very accessible slave narrative, Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, because he is such a literate and informed man when he goes into slavery, he's able to observe it well and to kind of process and articulate everything he sees going on, from children being separated from slave mothers around them, to sexual coercion of slave women, to beatings, to his own attempt to escape, his feelings on missing his family, just all of it is very poignant. It's second only in the pre-Civil War period to Frederick Douglass as a bestseller among slave autobiographies. This is a very widely circulated piece. And that's what it looks like. That's the frontispiece with his image. Still widely available today in paperback, hardback, online. You can read it if you want very easily. You can access it. It deeply impacted readers because it's a good, very detailed read. Well, he begins lecturing as soon as the book is out. And he lectures from July 1853 to 1857 in New York, in New England, and in Canada. Typically, lecturers like Solomon would go into an area, they'd talk to people who had a meeting room or talk to ministers about using the church or something like this. They'd set up a lecture schedule, and then they would go to the press, put ads in the paper for the schedule for their talks, and people would flock in, particularly people who were in areas that hadn't had a lot of personal contact with slavery. This was exotic. People would come in to find out. And there are cases, it's kind of amusing, but it also tells a lot. Cases where you would have black abolitionists who had experiences of slavery going into towns in northern Maine where the town had not seen a black person before. And so part of it's the exoticism involved. There were 2 plays written and performed in New York at the time about his story. He tried incessantly for a period of years to try to bring his kidnappers to justice. Many things worked against that. One is getting the proper evidence, getting friendly jurisdictions, because after all, Washington, D.C. was not a friendly jurisdiction. It was a slaveholding city. And ultimately, for one technicality or another, he was not able to get justice. He did get something else, notoriety that leads to the first federal attempt at reparations. This is my own contribution to the Solomon Northup story. As soon as his narrative began to be read, abolitionists in New York and other places in the North started generating petition campaigns to have Congress compensate him for his time in slavery, for his lost wages, his suffering, etc. Thousands of petitions, of signatures on petitions, went to Congress, where they were all tabled by committees headed by slaveholding Southern congressmen. But it did raise the question at the time of what the slaves were owed for their unpaid wages. There's evidence that in and after 1857, he also worked on the Underground Railroad in New York State and New England, helping other former slaves get northward to freedom. Well, what happens to Solomon Northup? That's a great mystery. A man who had been at the peak of national notoriety in the mid-1850s literally drops off the radar screen by the mid-1860s. After 1857, he increasingly fades into obscurity, and the time, the place, the circumstances of his death are completely unknown. If he had a gravestone today, this would be it. Nevertheless, over the past generation, with a movie, several books about it, additional plays, he's come back to public attention. And in Saratoga Springs, and Saratoga generally where the college is, this has become a virtual cottage industry. They celebrate Solomon Northup Day each year, and celebrity entertainers and historians and speakers come in from around the nation to help celebrate and to tease out more of the Solomon Northup story, because folks in that area see it as such a not only unique but important part of their heritage. So let me just throw up a couple things. One is, for those of you who are interested in reading his autobiography or reading a recent biography about him, these are the 2 sources to look at. Well, thanks so much.